Welcome to MedHeads. Could your diet be fueling your anxiety? The truth might surprise you. Don't go anywhere. Okay, so you've sent in some fascinating stuff, and we're going to take a deep dive into the link between what you eat and how anxious you might feel. We've got some broad advice from the good old Mayo Clinic, and then this super detailed scientific review pulling in a mountain of research from all over the place. PubMed Frontiers. It's really impressive, the scope of it.
Yeah, it's global, huh?
Yeah, it is. But the goal here is to give you something you can actually use, like a clear understanding of how your diet might be messing with your anxiety or helping it based on what the science actually says, right? Not just some internet fad diet.
Absolutely. And, this is a topic that's getting a lot of attention these days. So cutting through the noise and getting to the evidence-based stuff that you can put into practice is exactly what we're going to do. Taking both that trusted advice and then layering in some of those really in-depth findings from, the scientific community worldwide.
So let's kick things off with that Mayo Clinic perspective, because they're pretty upfront about this. They're like, look, changing your diet is not a magic wand that's going to poof away anxiety. And it's definitely not a replacement for professional help, right? If you need therapy or medication, that's still essential.
Yeah.
But they do lay out some pretty straightforward things you can do with your eating habits that might help as part of a bigger approach.
Absolutely. It's about practical adjustments, right? Building blocks you can actually integrate into your life. And one thing they emphasize is starting your day off right with some good quality protein. This isn't just about feeling full until lunch. It's about keeping your blood sugar levels nice and steady. I mean, think about it. When your blood sugar dips, you can feel shaky, irritable, and even more anxious.
Makes sense.
Protein helps avoid those drastic swings.
Yeah, and they really dig into carbohydrates too,
Yeah.
making a clear distinction between complex carbs, the kind you find in, your oatmeal quinoa, whole grain breads, and then the simple carbs, the sugary drinks, the snacks. The idea being that complex carbs are digested more slowly, so you get a slower, more gradual release of energy, which could mean a more stable mood too. And then there's the whole serotonin connection, that neurotransmitter in your brain that has that calming effect. Simple carbs, on the other hand, they just spike your blood sugar up and then it crashes down.
Yeah.
Which can totally make anxiety worse.
Right. It's about avoiding that energy roller coaster, right? Steady energy release, much more conducive to keeping things balanced emotionally.
And the Mayo Clinic also makes this point about hydration, which seems so basic, but it's something that so many people overlook.
It's amazing how much of an impact it can have, and it's easy to forget to drink enough water throughout the day, right?
Yeah.
You get busy, focused on other things, but it truly can make a difference.
For sure. They also talk about cutting back on or avoiding alcohol and caffeine. With alcohol, people often feel that initial sense of relaxation.
Yeah.
But then it often backfires and you end up feeling edgier and your sleep gets all messed up.
Yeah.
Caffeine, especially if you're sensitive to it or you have it too close to bedtime, it can actually mimic some of the physical symptoms of anxiety, the racing heart, jitters, and of course, sleep disruption.
These are really key points. The cycle of alcohol-induced sleep disruption leading to that next day, anxiety is incredibly common. And then caffeine, of course, being a stimulant, it can really amplify those feelings of nervousness and unease.
Right, and then they get into this whole thing about food sensitivities and additives, which I think is really interesting. Because some people might find that certain foods or ingredients trigger, uncomfortable physical reactions. And those reactions can then lead to shifts in mood, including irritability and, feeling more anxious.
Absolutely. It's about tuning into your body, right?
Right.
Really paying attention to how different foods make you feel and identifying if there are any culprits that seem to consistently trigger negative reactions.
Yeah.
Because those physical sensations can definitely feed into emotional states like anxiety.
It's almost like detective work with your own body.
Yeah, a little bit of self-experimentation, huh?
Okay, so we've got some really solid practical advice to start with from the Mayo Clinic. But now let's dive into that big scientific review, because this is where things get even more interesting. We're looking at a much broader picture, pulling in research from all over the world on this diet-anxiety connection.
Absolutely. This was a massive undertaking, this scoping review. They systematically examined a vast number of studies. I mean, their initial search yielded over 55,000 potentially relevant articles, which just shows you the breadth of research in this area globally. After a rigorous screening process, they honed in on over 1,500 studies that met their specific criteria. And the overall findings, while much more granular, do echo some of the practical advice we just discussed, but also offer a more nuanced understanding of specific dietary components and patterns.
So across all this global research, what stood out as the major takeaways? What kinds of diets or dietary components were linked to lower levels of anxiety?
Okay, so broadly speaking, diets rich in fruits and vegetables were associated with less anxiety. Adequate omega-3 fatty acids also appeared to be beneficial.
Okay.
And then diets that were classified as healthy overall dietary patterns.
Okay.
They also found a link between regularly eating breakfast and reduced anxiety. And sufficient intake of certain micronutrients and supplements like zinc, magnesium, selenium, probiotics also showed some promising associations. It's worth noting that many of these positive associations were observed consistently across different populations worldwide.
That is really interesting. So it's not just one culture, one region. This is appearing across the board.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating. And what about the flip side? What did the research suggest was linked to higher levels of anxiety?
Okay, so high-fat diets were associated with increased anxiety. Not surprising. Insufficient tryptophan and overall dietary protein also seem to be a factor.
Okay.
And then high intakes of added sugar and refined carbohydrates, again, aligning with that advice about limiting sugary foods and going for balanced meals.
Right.
They also found that unhealthy dietary patterns characterized by lots of processed foods were linked to heightened anxiety. But here's a critical caveat. And the review highlights this. A lot of the research in this area relies on animal studies or observational studies in humans. So we can see correlations, but it's harder to prove that a specific dietary factor directly causes changes in anxiety levels in people. There were fewer intervention studies where they actually looked at how changing someone's diet impacts anxiety in people diagnosed with anxiety disorders. So that's something to keep in mind. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Absolute crucial distinction. You can't jump to conclusions just because two things are linked.
Right.
Now, the review also dives into this idea of diet quality.
Right.
Which sounds like it's more than just what you eat, but the nutritional value of your food overall.
It is. It's a more holistic approach to nutrition. It's about recognizing that the quality of your calories, the source of your food, and the nutrient density are as important as the quantity. You could be eating a certain number of calories, but if they're coming from, junk food versus nutrient-rich whole foods, that's going to have a different impact on your body, including your mental well-being. So a high-quality diet is generally one that's diverse, balanced, and provides those essential nutrients your body needs to function optimally. However, defining and consistently measuring diet quality across different studies, that's where things get a little tricky. Researchers use different frameworks and indices to try to capture this concept.
And they looked at some specific dietary quality indices in relation to anxiety. Let's start with the DII and the Dietary Inflammatory Index and the Dietary Inflammation Score.
Yeah.
What did the research show there?
So these indices aim to estimate how inflammatory your diet is. And several studies have found that higher scores on the DII or the DIS, indicating a more pro-inflammatory diet, are associated with higher odds of experiencing anxiety.
Okay.
Interestingly, some research, particularly in women, has found a stronger link. And this makes sense when you think about the fact that chronic low-grade inflammation can also affect the brain. However, it's not a universal finding. Some studies haven't shown these strong links, or the associations become weaker after accounting for other factors. So it seems that the relationship between a pro-inflammatory diet and anxiety can depend on various individual things like your liver function, your hormone balance, how your body responds to stress, your HPA axis, and even the composition of your gut microbiome, which we'll talk about in a bit. It's not a simple equation.
So it's not like inflammatory diet equals anxiety for everyone. There are other variables at play.
Exactly. It's more complex than that.
Now, what about those other measures like the HEI and the AHEI, the Healthy Eating Index and the Alternative Healthy Eating Index? What did the global research suggest there?
Some studies indicated that higher HEI scores, which basically means you're following those national dietary guidelines more closely, were associated with decreased anxiety, especially in younger populations like adolescents. And with the AHEI, there were some studies that found a negative association with anxiety in women, but not so much in men. Again, hinting at the fact that diet might affect mental health differently in men and women.
It's like a whole other layer of complexity.
It is. It is. And the review actually emphasizes that this potential for sex-specific effects is a really important area for more research.
Yeah, for sure. What about the Dietary Diversity Score?
Yeah.
That one focuses on how varied your diet is in terms of different food groups, right?
Right. And a more diverse diet, particularly in adult women in some studies seem to be linked to lower anxiety levels. The thinking is that a wider variety of foods probably provides a wider range of nutrients.
It's like don't put all your eggs in one basket kind of thing, right?
Yeah, spread it out, get all those different nutrients. However, the review points out that there's not always consistency in how different studies define these food groups or what they consider a high versus low diverse diet. So it's a bit tricky to compare findings across the board.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Some more standardization needed there. Now, they also mentioned a bunch of other indices like the DQII, FQS, DPI, and DAI.
Yeah.
Anything noteworthy there?
Yeah, so some studies, often those involving women, have reported negative associations between those indices, which suggest a higher overall diet quality or antioxidant intake and anxiety symptoms. So again, supporting that idea that a better quality diet might be linked to lower anxiety.
So it seems like diet quality is a really promising area for understanding this whole connection. But the science is still emerging, and there's a need for more standardized ways to measure it and study it across different populations.
Absolutely.
Now, let's shift gears to broader dietary patterns, because the review also looked at those, like the famous Mediterranean and Nordic diets compared to more westernized eating patterns.
Yeah, this is where we start to see clearer trends emerging from global research. The Mediterranean and Nordic diets, which are typically packed with fruits, vegetables, whole grains, healthy fats like olive oil, fish, all those good things. They provide tons of antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds, and they're often associated with a reduced risk of anxiety. Western dietary patterns, on the other hand, which are characterized by high intake of red and processed meats, sugary drinks, and foods refined grains.
Yeah.
Those have been linked to higher levels of anxiety and may even contribute to changes in brain chemistry that make individuals more susceptible to feeling anxious.
So it's not just about the absence of good stuff, it's also the presence of those potentially problematic foods.
Exactly. And as we've touched on, the gut microbiome is increasingly thought to be a major player in mediating these effects.
Right. Now, what about vegetarian and vegan diets? Because those are often perceived as healthy. What did the global research indicate about their relationship with anxiety?
This is where the findings are a bit more mixed and less consistent across different studies. Some research has actually reported higher rates of anxiety in vegetarians compared to those who eat meat, while other studies have found lower anxiety levels in vegetarian and vegan men and sometimes in women as well. But the review is very cautious about interpreting these findings because there can be so many other differences between those dietary groups that aren't always accounted for in the research.
Right. So many other factors at play.
Right, like, why someone chose to be vegetarian or vegan, whether their diet is well-planned and meeting all their nutritional needs, those things could influence anxiety levels independently of the diet itself.
It's so hard to isolate just diet as a variable when there are so many other lifestyle choices and motivations involved. Now, they also mention these exploratory dietary patterns that emerge from the data itself. What are those all about?
So instead of starting with a predefined dietary pattern like the Mediterranean diet researchers use statistical analysis to identify patterns in how people actually eat. And some studies have linked junk food patterns, high in processed snacks, sugary drinks, unhealthy fats to higher levels of anxiety, which isn't all that surprising.
Not at all.
But when they've tried to identify traditional or healthy patterns within specific populations, the results have been less consistent. This is probably because these terms can mean very different things across different cultures and even across different studies within the same cultural context.
Yeah, traditional can be a very loaded term.
There can also be overlap in how they categorize foods. The review emphasizes that it's really crucial to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy plant-based food choices because not all plant-based diets are equal in terms of their nutritional value and their potential impact on mental health.
So just slapping a label like plant-based on something doesn't mean it's automatically good. You have to look at the specific food.
Absolutely. The details matter.
Okay, let's move on to what seems like a really fascinating area of research. The link between your diet, the trillions of microorganisms living in your gut microbiome, and anxiety.
This is a rapidly evolving field of research, and it's really exciting to see how much we're learning. The current thinking is that your diet has a profound impact on the composition and activity of your gut microbiome. And these microorganisms in your gut, they actually communicate with your brain and influence your mental health, including anxiety, through a variety of pathways.
Wow.
It's not just about digestion anymore.
No, not at all. So how does that work? How does the gut actually talk to the brain?
So there's direct signaling that happens through the nervous system connecting your gut and your brain.
Okay.
The gut microbiome produces various neuroactive substances like short-chain fatty acids that can impact brain function. It also affects levels of inflammation throughout your body, which can have downstream effects on the brain. And it even impacts the integrity of the lining of your gut, which is also thought to play a role in brain health.
Wow, it's like a whole intricate communication network.
It is. And the research has shown pretty consistently that both your dietary patterns and the makeup of your gut microbiome are linked to anxiety symptoms. For example, diets rich in fruits, vegetables, and fiber, they tend to promote a more diverse and balanced gut microbiome, which is generally associated with better health outcomes, including mental health.
Makes sense.
Conversely, those Western-style diets loaded with processed foods, unhealthy fats, and added sugars, they can lead to a less diverse, potentially imbalanced gut microbiome, which is linked to increased anxiety. The review even mentions specific types of bacteria that have been implicated in this relationship. For instance, Faecalibacterium and Roseburia are often found in greater abundance in people who consume healthier diets.
Okay.
And they tend to be associated with lower levels of anxiety. But then on the flip side, an increased presence of Tizarella has been linked in some studies to less healthy dietary patterns.
Interesting.
And what's even more interesting is that some of these associations between specific bacteria and anxiety seem to differ between men and women.
Of course.
Again, highlighting that we need to consider sex as a variable in this research. And this whole understanding of the gut-brain connection opens up amazing possibilities for developing personalized nutritional strategies that could target an individual's gut microbiome to help them manage anxiety.
Yeah, that's really getting into the nitty-gritty. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So we've talked about overall diet quality and patterns.
Yeah.
What about individual nutrients? Are there any specific vitamins or minerals that have strong, clear links to anxiety?
So when it comes to the macronutrients, those big players like carbs and protein, the research on their direct impact on anxiety has been kind of mixed so far.
Okay.
But the quality of carbohydrates, for example, choosing whole grains over refined ones, does seem to matter because of that blood sugar stability piece we talked about earlier.
Right.
With fats, there's some evidence suggesting that a higher ratio of unsaturated fats to saturated and trans fats might be associated with lower anxiety. Omega-3s and omega-6s, those have been studied a lot, but the results are still a bit mixed. Some studies show potential benefits of omega-3s, particularly EPA and DHA, the ones found in fatty fish for reducing anxiety symptoms, but others don't find significant effects.
Got it.
Fiber is another interesting one. There's growing evidence, particularly in women, that higher fiber intake is linked to improved anxiety, and we know that fiber is essential for feeding those beneficial gut bacteria.
Makes sense.
And then there are micronutrients like zinc and magnesium, where some studies have suggested potential benefits for anxiety, but more research is needed to confirm those findings and figure out optimal dosages.
So it seems like the overall dietary pattern has a more consistent link to anxiety than any one single nutrient, although specific nutrients definitely play a role and research is ongoing. Now let's talk about the practical implications of all this research. What can people actually do with this information?
The key takeaway is this. While diet alone can't cure anxiety, making an effort to adopt healthier eating habits can be a valuable first step in managing it and promoting your overall well-being. And this might work, at least in part, by positively influencing your gut microbiome. So prioritizing whole unprocessed foods, loading up on fruits, vegetables, and fiber, those are all great places to start. The review also discusses the potential role of probiotics and prebiotics as dietary supplements. Probiotics are those live beneficial bacteria, and prebiotics are basically food for those bacteria. There's some evidence that specific strains of probiotics might help reduce anxiety, possibly by influencing the production of neurotransmitters like GABA, which has calming effects in the brain.
Interesting.
Prebiotics, like certain types of plant-based fibers, have also shown some promise in reducing anxiety and the body's stress response potentially by altering the gut microbiome and increasing the production of those beneficial short-chain fatty acids.
There's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, and the review highlights that whole diet interventions, those that focus on shifting your overall eating patterns, could be really valuable not only in clinical settings for people with anxiety, but also in the wider community as a potential preventative measure. It's like using food as medicine in a way.
Exactly. Food as a foundation for mental health.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Now, the review also talks about some important considerations for future research.
So basically, more rigorous and multifaceted approach to studying this whole complex relationship is needed. To sum it all up, while diet isn't a magic cure, The growing body of evidence really suggests that what you eat can have a significant impact on your overall well-being and can potentially influence how anxious you feel. That practical advice from the Mayo Clinic, like prioritizing protein at breakfast, choosing complex carbs, staying hydrated, being mindful of alcohol and caffeine intake, it aligns with the broader patterns observed in the scientific literature, which emphasizes the benefits of whole unprocessed foods, lots of fruits and vegetables, and limiting processed stuff. And the emerging science around the gut microbiome offers some exciting new avenues for understanding and potentially managing anxiety through dietary interventions.
Absolutely, it's about taking a holistic approach to health, recognizing that everything is interconnected.
So as we wrap up, here's a final question for you to think about. What small, sustainable changes could you realistically make to your diet that you might want to explore to see if they have a positive impact on how you feel? Take a moment to reflect on your current eating habits and consider the potential benefits of making even a few mindful adjustments to support your well-being. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.